Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War. I'm Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, here with you. And as always, we welcome Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia SME, on what's going to be a very busy episode because it's been as Yuval likes to put it, it's been a very newsy period. And it's interesting because I often pester Yuval like every few days, be like, hey, something happened. Should we record now? Should we record now? And he'll be very practical and be like, just wait, there's going to be plenty to talk about here in a second. And that is indeed the case, because if we'd done one 72 hours ago, we would not have the same things to talk about that we do right now. So Yuval, welcome back. And I think as you were talking about, what we'll do is kind of just pick up the threads of things that had just happened the last time we recorded one of these. And there were a few. Last time we talked, the referenda in which Putin was going to annex the occupied territories, well, partially occupied in some cases, that his forces were in, annex them through a sham referenda and include them in the Russian Federation. We were on the bow wave of the mobilization process. And then I think it was just like a few hours after the explosions on the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. Those had just happened, and we sort of hit that, but didn't really have much more information about it. So I guess starting with those various threads, how have those things developed over the last few weeks, couple weeks?
So I think this is like a good moment to just recognize it does not appear that the Putin and the Kremlin have a strategy. They seem to be taking decisions that attend to the news cycle more than anything else. And so there has been, as you put it, and one of the reasons I keep saying let's not record today is that I'm just lying down on the floor, just hoping it all passes. But we're basically like, not just in the past, let's say, I think 10 days or 2 weeks since we had our last episode, but really taking like today's news, which is a series of missile strikes against civilian targets in Kyiv and other cities across the country, is in effect, like a very deadly temper tantrum, because the past month has been a very bad series of news events for the Russian side. And really, even before the issues with annexation, we had the Ukrainians achieving success, having sort of indicated or signaled that they were going to do the big counteroffensive in Kherson. They instead went with a surprise counterattack in Kharkiv region. That one helped basically take back into Ukrainian control huge territories of land. This created, and this is going to be a theme that basically will define not just the rest of this episode, but also this conflict and the rest of Putin's time in office, however long or short that may be. The counteroffensive success in Kharkiv created for the first time substantial and united criticism of Putin from basically the nationalist right. Putin has long been criticized by liberals, people from the center, people from the left. He clearly does not care about that. There's enough Rosgvardia and other sort of riot police, administrative resources that can take care of all of those people who want better relations with the outside world. They don't matter. But what does matter is Putin having the reputation of being the person who knows what's around the corner, what's a couple moves down the line, and that he's the person who can make Russia great. He's the person who can expand Russia's territory as well as international prestige. The people who are, often referred to as like military bloggers or nationalist bloggers, these are the people who have been basically embedded with Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's Republic, but also Russian troops over the last number of years. These are the people who are on basically the front line of Russia's attacks against Ukraine. And these are the people who basically said once the Ukrainian counteroffensive was successful, was that Putin doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't basically have Russia's troops, their interests at heart. And with him, it's not clear that Russia's going to win this war. And that was their anger that was then reflected on Russian state media of not being totally, and obviously in Russian state media, people are a lot wealthier, so they're a lot more careful. but basically the same story. Is Putin going to be the person that gives Russia the victory it deserves, or is he going to give that Russia the victory to Russia's, feared and hated and totally despised rivals, the Ukrainians, and thereby NATO itself? That's what led Putin basically to announce snap mobilization of what's going to be at the very end of the day several 100,000 people. Um, some poor suckers of that first group found themselves from notice as little as 3 to 4 days. Um, this is also at the time that we were seeing Wagner, the private military company, was also recruiting heavily within Russian prisons, and a lot of those people took the opportunity to basically serve in Ukrainian prison instead of Russian prison. So we had Kherson, we had Kharkiv, counteroffensive mobilization. That did not really change anything on the battlefield. Thereafter, we also had the Nord Stream 2 pipelines getting destroyed underwater. And for that, we've now seen basically, still we don't have any, firm, public conclusions, but we know that the only one of the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines that was not, exploded in some way is the very one that Germany would not permit to be functional as of a couple of months ago at the beginning of the conflict itself, thereby putting Germany in a position that either they get zero Russian gas or basically they have to open up the one they said they would never open. So it also ostensibly limits Gazprom's liability for not delivering gas, thereby being able to invoke force majeure protections. So protecting Gazprom from financial liability, as well as putting Germany in a bad spot, that suggests that it was Russia who did it. We then, as you said, got to the Kherson counteroffensive, which also was going fairly well, which then put Russia in a position where it looked like, as of a couple days ago, that Kherson itself was in danger of being surrounded, was in danger of basically getting to the position where the Russian forces inside the city, not the entire region, but inside the city itself, would be surrounded and then either destroyed or forced into mass surrender. That's what basically sped ahead all of the plans of the Russians to hold these basically false referenda. And these are the referenda that Russia said they weren't going to do it while the war was ongoing, but then the Ukrainians were doing well. So they did it, they delayed it, canceled it, then basically did it ahead of schedule. And at that point, they basically did the thing they did in Crimea. Have these referenda of these regions to declare that they no longer wanted to be part of Ukraine as independent countries, states, whatever, regions, people's republics. They then asked for admission or accession into the Russian Federation. That was decided by the Russian Federation through a vote in their Federation Council, their upper house of the parliament. Then Putin recognized that decision with the decree. They had a big party and they got into a very weird spot. And the weird spot was the very areas that they annexed were not under their control. So Ukraine was in the position of continuing to take land that Russia claimed as its own. That put Russia in a position where their presidential spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, said that they would continue to consult with local populations as to the trajectory and timing to the Russian Federation. Russia also then continued to hit Zaporizhia and Kherson with rockets or with missiles, which is in fact Russia then hitting its own cities with missiles in order to, I'm not sure what, legally speaking, of course. And that's basically where Russia is right now. They don't have their own international borders defined. That's a weird and bad place to be in. And then we get to, and I think this is the part where the news is moving very fast, is the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. That was attacked in some sort of way. And welcome to discuss like what that was. But in general, this is, as we were talking beforehand, as you mentioned, this bridge, very complicated, engineering feat. This is the symbol of taking Crimea into the Russian Federation. And as I said, I think on a couple of episodes ago, Crimea is not Russia's Jerusalem in terms of, the symbolic feature of success, the symbolic heart of the country, but it is Putin's Jerusalem. And the bridge to Crimea is the symbol of everything that Putin has worked towards in his time as Russia's leader. And that's essentially the core thing that was attacked. And that's where we got today to Russia's, use of whatever precision guided munitions it has left to attack Ukrainian cities and their infrastructure, but not hitting any military targets that would have affected, in some way, what Ukraine is able to do on the battlefield. And that, trying to do that as quickly as possible is Russia's last 2 weeks.
It's the how I feel a very small amount of pity for Putin's official spokesman, because you got to change your story almost on the hour, depending on what's happened. As you mentioned, they were bombing their own territory recently annexed because they didn't actually control it. And if I remember correctly, the city of Lyman, which is back in the Kharkiv region, that was annexed, and then it was liberated like 1 or 2 days later. And the story was, oh no, that we didn't annex that part, right? That wasn't included in the annexation and the referendum, although it was 48 hours before. Looking at the bridge and Putin's response, and this kind of we can talk a little bit about that more here in a minute. But that also, as we were talking before we recorded, there are some power struggle dynamics going on inside the various, Putin's apparatuses or apparati of power, between the military and various security services. And it's possible some of that is tangled up in the bridge itself. But if we could maybe go back a few days or a week or so, there were some manifestations of that, I think, within Russia and Moscow as well, indicating that there were, I don't know about if power grab is the right phrase, but finger pointing and trying to shift blame. And what did you see in terms of that among those various apparatuses, and what does that indicate about one, the various perspectives of those apparatuses about how well or not the war is going, but what does it also indicate about Putin's hold on the levers of power in the state?
It's a good question, and that first basically requires us to figure out, like, why has Putin been able to rule more or less single-handedly, although he spent 4 years as the prime minister when he was initially term limited. They've since changed the constitution, so he doesn't really have to worry about term limits anymore. But in essence, how has he ruled for 22 years and counting at this point? He's been able to do it through doing two very different things. One is the ability to impose discipline on all of his subordinates. And the subordinates basically saying, oh, I need to do something because the boss is going to be mad at me. So therefore, let me shape what the next person beneath me is going to do, so on and so forth. And that's, what the Russians call the power vertical. The belief that, in essence, power ultimately, from the lowest civil servant in some dusty village in the back end and beyond, that person thinks, I have a boss, and that person has a boss, so on and so forth, and eventually you get to Putin. That is basically the vertical of power. The other key thing that Putin has been able to do for basically so many years is maintain the balance of all the different elite factions. So that in essence, all of those elite factions think, that with their heads and all the, various competitors to each other, I may not like my rivals, I may not totally love all of my allies, but if Putin weren't here, basically to keep the peace between us, there's no possible way I would trust any of these piranhas around me. And if I don't trust these piranhas around me, it's likely that if they don't trust me either. Or the thing to do is basically have preventive strikes against all of the potential people who could be taking me out. And that is what, Russians often refer to, this sort of Game of Thrones type thing, where different people are taking each other out in order to protect themselves. Russians call that smutное время, times of troubles. That's the key thing that Putin has been able to do for so long, is to get people to think whatever I think about Putin directly, whatever I think about, the trajectory or the direction of the country, the one thing that I'm totally convinced that he can do is that he can mediate and moderate all of these different rivalries at the elite level better than anybody else. He's the best of all available alternatives. So what we've seen over the last number of weeks isn't just the inability of the Russian state to really do things, which suggests, that's about the vertical of power, getting sort of state capacity to do specific things that the regime wants. The thing that is most worrisome probably to Putin is that you have Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's outside government, and who's basically his only qualification for the job is that he's Putin's friend. Him and Ramzan Kadyrov are directly telling the generals in the Ministry of Defense, up to and including the Minister of Defense and the chairman of not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chief of the Russian General Staff, mixing between Gerasimov and Milley, their titles, is that they're telling these people, they should be stripped of all their medals, they should just be given a gun and sent to the front barefoot. The deputy head of Kherson region, Russian appointed official, Kirill Steremosov, he said that Shoigu should kill himself. Now, these are all people who are not, clearing their comments, with Putin, but these are people who don't believe that the military, the actual Ministry of Defense and the military are doing well enough in the field that they will be protected by Putin as soon as someone else gives them a shove. And that indicates not that Putin has lost control of, let's say, the bureaucracy, but that people aren't afraid of him in terms of being able to mediate these disputes by forcing Putin to make these choices. You back the losers in the Russian army, or you back us, who basically want to take the fight to the Ukrainians that much harder. And that's very destabilizing signal for Russian power.
And I do recall, and so for those for the listeners, just to revisit those names, Kadyrov, he's the current Chechen. I don't know what's his title, warlord,
I just think of
plenipotentiary.
him. Yeah, no, he and Putin have basically a medieval relationship. There's a lord and the vassal has his own fiefdom. But technically, he is he's the leader of Chechnya, and has a very he's one of the few people in Russia that has his own private army of roughly 20,000.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to just make sure we identified the right person. Although I think, as we've also discussed, they're in some aspects they're very much sort of a Hollywood army. They're great about taking TikToks of themselves in combat, and I'm using air quotes here because a lot of those promotional videos have been identified as not actually being in combat or staged with various levels of production values. But in terms of the comments of these very senior generals, like people, maybe people in the West or in the U.S. sort of military may not be as familiar with Shogu, but Gerasimov is a name that was on a lot of people's lips, back in sort of 2014, 2015 timeframe, and this magical doctrine that he, allegedly had. Although I don't think that that was a little maybe more made out of it than was actually there, or maybe a lot more. I don't know. But point is, his name was very well known. So to have these folks told to basically go and throw themselves on their swords at the front line, it's a very strange dynamic, sort of shift in who's in Putin's good graces to watch. So then let's go to the attack on the Kerch Bridge itself, because again, as we were talking about before we started hitting recording, it's not certain what sort of method of delivery the strike was done with. But as you were mentioning, there's maybe a non-zero probability that this, sort of shifting power dynamic between the apparatuses of security and military may have had something to do with it themselves. If you want to maybe expand on that theory.
So we over the past couple days, there's been, in essence, four different, let's say, theories or sort of for what happened. Two of Ukrainians did it, and then two were into the realm of more conspiratorially minded individuals. So obviously, the let's the two theories of Ukrainian performance is that one, this could have been some sort of missile attack, and two, some sort of special operations truck bomb that was basically a truck bomb that was timed to detonate underneath a train that was carrying fuel and thus much more flammable. So both of those are obviously seemingly very complicated to get through Russian air defense, as well as getting through basically the idea that Russia knows what's going on in its on its roadways. And what we were saying beforehand is the Ukrainians have been very active in promoting sort of the truck bomb theory, because this, as you said, I want to take your glory. This puts this plants the seed of doubt into the Russians, and basically them having to inspect so many more different trucks that basically cross this roadway, and basically providing one more, at least short-term, logistical difficulty for the Russians. We saw that this attack basically took out one of the roadways, although there's two roadways, and damaged the rail lines that go above the roadways. This is not probably the Russians are going to be able to fix this over the next couple of weeks, perhaps the next couple of months. But obviously, this slows down what the Russians can do in terms of supplying Crimea and therefore supplying Kherson. So could be the Ukrainians just slowing down logistics, as they've done basically throughout this conflict, so that they can attack Kherson much more aggressively. Now, the Russians did it to themselves stories. We should at least share with listeners and viewers. First theory that I heard was the Russian military did this, and the story here goes, they know that they're going to lose in Kherson. They're just going to lose that. They're going to have a humiliating loss. The army in the field on basically the west bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson, 15,000 troops there. They're all going to get destroyed, engage in a mass surrender. It's going to be humiliating. That basically is baked into how fast the Ukrainians are advancing and the slowness of basically the mobilized troops getting to the front. So knowing that this is going to happen, since the FSB, the intelligence service, the security services, are responsible for the defense of that bridge, having some basically story to tell about how they didn't get the supplies in time because of the lax security, he provides the military with a story on how they can basically shift the blame from themselves to the FSB. So there's that. And then of course, like, you're starting into again, various stories on who's responsible. Did the Russians do it to themselves? And so the other story that I heard is that because Putin and the people around him noticed that there is clearly rising social anxiety about basically this war and the special military operation. Basically, even the state-run public opinion polling shows that people continue to support the special military operation. They continue to support Putin. But in terms of second-order issues, the numbers of people who know people who are leaving the country, who know people who want to leave the country, people reporting anxiety, people reporting anxiety in others, all the things that people want to say about themselves, but they're too afraid to do so. An attack on something that Russians consider their own, and not just something that's happening in a different country, that this will then basically shape the information space inside Russia itself to then justify any manner of brutal, horrible things against the Ukrainians, and in fact create the demand within Russia to do all the sort of super violence that we've seen. And in the last basically 12 hours or so, since the Ukrainian, so let's say 12 to 72 hours. When the Kerch Bridge was hit, all of these sort of nationalist bloggers, all these people on TV were really, the bloggers more, the people on TV less, all of them were criticizing Putin, directly or indirectly, criticizing his choice of military people, criticizing the military strategy, criticizing basically power itself in a way that had not been seen even over the last couple of weeks, even after the Kharkiv counteroffensive, which led to the mobilization. So therefore, and what in the last 12 hours, all these people could not hide their excitement over basically destruction in Ukraine. They have a need to injure, to hurt, to see others being hurt in order to make themselves feel better. This is in essence the theory of basically mass indiscriminate violence that we've seen how they were able to achieve, basically a stalemate / victory in Chechnya, how they're able to achieve victory in Syria. And this is what they're doing to the Ukrainians right now. So between Ukrainian missile attack, Ukrainian truck bomb, military seeking to, shift the blame onto others, and the Russian state basically preparing the Russian population for more violence and therefore reprisals. So that's basically the range of, who done it.
And that's a very tangled web. And for our listeners and viewers, when we were talking about this before, I told Yuval, like, there's cutting off your nose to spite your face, and this almost, if this is the inside job, this is like cutting off your head to spite the rest of you. I I don't get it, but that doesn't mean that there's a zero chance that it happened. And I think we'll go into here in a second, but we're really, if you haven't got the sense yet out there that there are different decision making calculuses at play here, this is potentially another data point in that, that we are really looking at different priorities from what we and the Ukrainians kind of see, and what the Russian populace and Russian leadership sees. So shifting to, we talked about the Russian response a little bit already today, but so I think it was early. It would have been like middle of the night our time. I think early morning, basically the beginning of the business day, Ukrainian time. But the Russian response, and they said it was coming, and nobody was surprised, I think, when it was. But it was one of the highest volume of sort of long range missile strikes that have been done for a considerable amount of time in the conflict. I think it was on the order of close to 80 missiles and munitions that were launched. I think about half of them actually got through. And so if you want to talk about with these, and we've mentioned before, Russia's got dwindling stocks of long-range precision munitions. Their ability to reconstitute those stocks is getting degraded because the supplies their economy needs to make those things are being hit by the sanctions. But with all that, with this unusually large swarm of missions, what did they choose to shoot at? And what was what was the reaction on the Russian side once they'd seen what they'd done?
So basically they didn't go after military targets. They went after elections. They went after symbols of the Ukrainian people, such as the National University, and they were able to get public parks and the children's playgrounds. So with whatever munitions they had left, they didn't go after military targets that would make some sort of difference on the battlefield. The effect, and this is, as we're talking, it clearly, at least the evidence seems to be building up, is that this sort of missile salvo was intended for the bloggers and for the sort of people who go on to the talk shows in the evening time. So about the narrative itself, the narrative, up until yesterday was, we're not doing well in the battlefield. The Ukrainians are coming after us. They're hitting our treasured symbols. The talk today, we're finally giving it to them. And that suggests that this is not really going to change the trajectory of the conflict. Because if Putin is more concerned about shoring up his domestic critics rather than trying to win on the battlefield, there's certainly going to be a lot more violence against Ukrainian cities. but certainly not an uptick in violence against the troops in the field. So as the troops in the field keep advancing, on the Russian front line, we're going to get to basically whatever is going to be the conclusion of the conflict. That and so one of the things that we're looking up right before this started, taping this episode, is President Biden and President Zelensky of Ukraine. They had a call today, and in the White House's readout, uh, the the White House said that they were going to increase the supply of advanced air defense systems to Ukraine. Obviously, they didn't say exactly what it's going to be. We could go into the different sorts of systems that the United States has, against cruise missiles, against ballistic missiles, etc. But what this was meant to do, ostensibly from the Russian side, is essentially threaten the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government with, we're going to do so much more violence against you that our capacity for violence basically exceeds your capacity to withstand that violence. Ukrainian people seem to uh, hate Russians and Putin like just the same as before. This is probably not going to, break their resolve. So we see that this is probably not going to change too much of the dynamics in terms of the Ukrainian people, the Russian leadership, but it changes the nightly news in Russia. It also, in terms of trying to create something for the Ukraine and its partners in the West, ostensibly what the Russians are trying to do is get the West to believe that Ukraine is not an investment worth continuing to pour diplomatic capital, military equipment, all the various things that the West has done in order to shore up Ukraine's ability to defend itself. But today, basically every single Western leader said, we're going to open up this fund, we're going to give this piece of military equipment. As I said, air defense coming from President Biden's office. So, in terms of what Ukraine is able to do, they're able to carry on the status quo of winning on the battlefield. Russia got basically a good news cycle out of this, and to that seems to continue to suggest that Ukraine is going to take more and more of its territory, at least for the short to medium term. It's unclear at this point whether they're going to continue to be able to fight throughout the winter, but if they are, then Russia's really going to have to see whether they can continue to defend their gains over the course of the winter. And they have been able to do so in basically better circumstances, or better weather than before.
And yeah, and actually on the I think on the fighting in the winter side, not to delve off too much onto a sidebar, but um I've been noting in some of the reports of what other countries, including European countries, and I want to say maybe I think it was Germany within the last week, specifically donating cold weather clothing and articles that would enable you to continue operations. Um, once once conditions deteriorate to the point of the non-campaigning season, as historically winter was sort of looked at. And I think it's certainly something as we're getting into the fall now here, getting into the colder weather in Europe, something to watch because yeah, historically and especially in that part of Europe, winter ended your campaigning season. There are certain I think the environmental constraints on things like roadways and supply lines would continue to happen, but if one side has really good cold weather gear, that makes it easier, at least for the human side, to continue the operation. Whereas the other side, we talked about this either at the very beginning of the war, and then I think it was one or two episodes ago, but on the conversely in February, you had Russian soldiers who were, had severe frostbite or who were found frozen on the battlefield. That situation has likely not improved, especially if you're shotgunning hundreds of thousands of conscripts, and you've already emptied out, the best gear from your storehouses. And in fact, I think it was earlier this week, there was a video making the rounds of Russian soldiers not getting like cold weather socks and cold weather boots, but some sort of foot wrap that looked like something out of, First World War or the 1800s.
Yeah, no, it was would have been familiar to veterans of like the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, and I think, back to, like, what does what does the American military do for cold weather operations? We got all kinds of, like, in there's layers of socks, there's layers of gear, and fleece underclothing, and Gore-Tex waterproof stuff, like all kinds of things to help you be warm. And this is what the Russians are pulling out is foot wraps. Very stark contrast, even to something as simple as what your foot is wrapped in. Okay, I guess I think we've sort of hit the usual. What's the state of Russian media? Putin made them happy today, like, as you said, for a news cycle. Although I continue to wonder, is that really, like, the time frame that their decision making is feeding in right now? Because, yeah, as we talk about a lot of stuff before we start recording, but the decisions in the targeting cycle that we see for the use of these, increasingly limited munitions, it's very hard to understand. If you were holding back 80 something PGMs to do a really hard counterpunch, okay, you just got that today, but you didn't change the impact on the battlefield, but you shored up your domestic support for a news cycle. Is there really no longer term thinking going on to be like, hey, maybe if I lose the war, maybe that's really bad for domestic support. Maybe those missiles would have been better applied to Ukrainian supply lines running through Western Ukraine, or if not that, there are still supply lines going to the Kharkiv and Kherson fronts. That's now 80 fewer missiles that didn't go there that you now don't have in the future. And it just seems like an incredibly short-sighted targeting cycle. But is that what sort of Putin is doing right now? He's like a day-to-day survival mode in terms of just sort of trying to shore up his domestic base for a little bit longer. Is there no sort of longer term strategy that you're seeing?
Well, I mean, the strategy is they have to do something now. Uh, now that now that it's clear, through data released by um, the Russian Statistical Service Agency, the Ministry of Finance, the Central Bank of Russia, it's it's become clearer that we're in a position right now to basically, when thinking about the Russian economy, like that's sort of like a good long-term question. The Russian economy is at a point where it's clear the sanctions are really doing a number. The GDP of Russia is probably going to go down, depending on various estimates, somewhere between 5 and 7% just this year. That means that there's going to be budget cuts for everything but basically defense stuff going forward. So therefore, 2023 is going to be something in between a giant recession slash depression, and everyone's going to be upset because there's not going to be much spending on anything that Russians inside Russia can enjoy. There's not going to be much in the way of imports coming in. So all news for basically next year, economically speaking, is going to be bad. That suggests that you need to do something now. The battlefield, as we described, it's going in one direction, and it's one direction only. Therefore, what can be done? Maintaining basically popular support and trying to use things such as, targeting, like, let's just put it, right-wing supporters in the United States and other countries, and trying to basically shift elections in Western countries so that new governments or the Congress goes to like different parties, so that the amount of support that Ukraine gets from Western partners becomes that much more difficult. That seems to be basically the 6 month strategy. Lose as little as possible, create as much violence as possible against the Ukrainians so that your basically most fervent supporters are satisfied, with their bloodlust, and then see over the course of 6 months, can basically Europe and the United States change enough to just limit what Ukraine can do? And once basically Western support for Ukraine is limited in some way, that's the moment that basically the the bleeding or the losing can stop, and they can try and get some sort of negotiated settlement with the Ukrainians that would allow them to basically pause the conflict while they rebuild their military. That seems to be, as fantastical as that sounds, that seems to be the 6 month strategy at this point.
Yeah, and as you describe it right there, it's not a great it's not a great strategy. It's kind of what they have left, but it's also it's not without some merit from a certain perspective. Although again, I think a lot of the assumptions that Putin has made from before the war started, through today, he is badly miscalculated, and it's entirely possible he'll find that even that strategy of trying to do certain things to influence the next European or American election cycle don't pan out quite the way he wanted. And that's also assuming that there are certain things the Ukrainians might not do in the coming weeks, depending on how the cold weather goes. And I think something to definitely watch is thus far, the Ukrainian government has proven, pretty shrewd and forward-looking in a way that Putin has not been at all. So I would not at all be surprised to watch sort of attempts for much more aggressive action on the battlefield through the winter season in defiance of some historical expectation, because they know that, as we said in one of the first episodes, like there's lots of clocks ticking, that influencing Western support is one of those clocks. But nothing succeeds like success, which is why, you keep going for a few more weeks into the winter. That's just going to provide more evidence that, as you've mentioned before, they're using weapons to effect. Give them more, and we can wrap this thing up soon. So we'll see. So I guess we've been going for a while. I'll ask you one last point here, and then we can wrap it up. Is, with all the things that have been going on in the last couple of weeks, what's one big thing you're going to be watching, whether it's internally to Russia or on the battlefield in Ukraine here in the next week or so?
I guess for the next week or so, it's basically the Twitter / TikTok wars. The ability of Putin to basically manage the elite infighting. Because if these people, because it could very well be that Putin is allowing this to happen so that basically the Prigozhin, the Wagner guy, and Kadyrov, they get their licks in on the military, and then they'll see, like, does this motivate the military to do any better? The Russians have just appointed a general, Surovikin, to oversee basically the entire special military operation, as it were. This is a guy who's known for, one, responsible for the only deaths. In 1991, when basically the Soviet hardliners were doing a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, they failed and it was nearly bloodless. But there were three civilians who were killed from the Russian military that was basically trying to take over various points in Moscow. The young captain responsible for ordering his troops to fire upon those civilians, this exact same guy. That was the first time he went to jail. The second time, he was involved in just like a bit of gun running. This is also a guy who was responsible for quite a lot of violence against civilians in Chechnya and in Syria as well. So certainly we're going to see how the Russian military responds to basically criticism coming from outside the state, from these security services connected people, and whether that makes any difference to how well they're able to reverse gains on the battlefield, and how they're able to win the PR battle on Russian TV as well.
Yeah, the whether the Russian military can change is always something to watch, and yeah, I guess we'll see, because as we've mentioned before, their ability to be a learning organization or a non-learning organization does not seem to have improved over time. Sometimes a new leader can come in and put a new culture and kind of a new approach to things in, if they're competent enough. Um, Something to watch. But again, there's a clock running against him, because how do you get that culture built when you're trying to stop the bleeding of huge reversals on the battlefield? So, all right. Well, we will look at that, and we'll revisit that next time we sit down and do one of these. All right, Yuval. Again, I always thank you for your time, and I hope you spend less time on the floor here in the coming weeks.
Yeah.
And more enjoying some other things that are more pleasant. But
happy trails.
yeah, you too as well.